So these are the topics I was asked to speak about. I'm quite happy to speak about them, but with the proviso that coroners are lawyers, not clinicians, and we are not funded to research causes of suicide. What we are funded to do is investigate deaths from suicide or suspected suicides, and to make recommendations and comments that may prevent similar deaths occurring in the future. So I'm not an expert on suicide prevention, and neither are my coroners. I think we've seen enough of the figures. 606 for the 2016-17 year, so up from the previous financial year. And well, I'll talk about the first 3 months of the new financial year as we get to them. So from our perspective, obviously, because we have 606 suicides per year, that means the 17 coroners plus me, the chief coroner, are investigating these deaths, and we come across patterns that we recognise as being a pattern. And we pass this information on to try and help researchers. But one of the patterns we see is this increased risk of suicide for people who have been have had a suicide in their family or a close friend. They are at increased risk of suicide themselves. We frequently come across guilt or anger of those left behind, which is really sad because a lot of the families and whānau are not equipped. They don't know, they don't have the tools, they haven't been given them on how to deal with it, but they feel really guilty because their loved one told them that they were thinking of suicide, but then said, but don't worry, I won't do it because of the dog, or because of the children, or because of my colleagues, one person said, which I thought was very thoughtful of him. But then they suicide. So the person left is left feeling that I did the wrong thing, I said the wrong thing, or I didn't say the right thing. So that we get these feelings of anger from the families that we deal with. And then we also get anger directed towards us, that this person did not commit suicide. And you, coroner, must not find that this was an accidental overdose. They would not have done that to me. And so we sometimes get anger directed at us by the family. And unfortunately in our system, it takes coronial cases a long time to get through the system. And so we might be talking 2 years down the track from the death. The coroner is finalising their investigation and issuing their findings, and all these feelings get brought up again. And then obviously the loss to society from losing that person is immense. So what do we do? So from a practical point of view, we tell CASA, and purpose of that is to allow interventions in the community at an early stage. So we have a 24-hour system, and I'll get to that in the next slide, but one of the things we do is try and initiate some actions within hours of the suicide being reported to us. And all suicides in New Zealand must be reported to the coroner. Coroners make recommendations to prevent similar deaths in the future. We provide all our findings to the Ministry of Health to assist with their research, and obviously we do public speaking. So we are in a position to identify trends, but as I said, I don't have the answers, and if I did, I would have told you all by now. So we have a 24-hour centre called NIO, which is the National Initial Investigation Office. There is a coroner on duty 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, public holidays, and a suspected suicide is reported to our 24-hour office and then to the duty coroner. NIO then notifies Clinical Advisory Services Aotearoa, and they provide the community post-vention response. And then it's forwarded to the relevant DHBs for them to make some response in the communities. So that's our initial actions, is to just let somebody know so that somebody can look at that family or school or whatever and say, do we need to put some resources in here because they have been affected by suicide. And I already talked about the recommendations. So from our own sort of practice perspective, we've been looking at how we investigate suicide, how we can make it more useful to all of you who are working trying to prevent it. And I'm open to suggestions. If somebody wants to come and see me and tell me some information you think would be useful, please come and see me at lunch and we'll discuss that. But we sat down with the Ministry of Health and all the coroners, and we agreed an investigation guideline, which is just for coroners to use to ask questions of themselves to gather data. So clearly we're looking at social media data from the person who has died. We're looking at whether they were known to the school counsellor, whether there's been bullying issues, whether their GP knew anything about their depression or suicidal thoughts, whether they were under the mental health service. So there's a whole 2-page list of data that we should be collecting in each of our investigations and then reporting on. And some of it we're reporting in the negative. So this person did not have a GP, for example, or this person was not known to the mental health service, or even I don't know whether they have a GP because we haven't been able to find one. So we try and put that in our reports so that we're of some use to the researchers and also to make our reports more consistent. But as I said, this is just a recent thing, so if anyone has any great ideas about what we should be looking at, I'm happy to hear them. Now, obviously when we're looking at our statistics, which we issue every year, they're always called provisional statistics, and that is because the coronial investigation can take more than a year. So what we're reporting on is the provisional suspected suicides for the financial year, and these are the groups that are always overrepresented, and I'm sure you all know that given that you're experts in the field. So just breaking that down, for Māori suicide, as you can see there, so about 15% of the population, but more than, so you've got over here the percentage of suicide, so clearly overrepresented, and consistently so. So 130 deaths in the last financial year. And then we have the youth, always overrepresented. And those are the figures there, and they've kind of swapped around in the last 2 financial years, but a very worrying trend. So for the first 3 months of this financial year, the numbers are up, but you can't really take a lot from that because, as we've talked about already this morning, they tend to go up and down month by month. So I can't say that it's a trend that's going to continue for the rest of the year, but we do keep track of them every month, and the figures are up in the first 3 months. That's July, August, September of this financial year. We're seeing more. And if you're looking at the calendar year, obviously the bottom figure, we're up 72 from the same time last in 2015. So obviously we're keeping an eye on that. So we're keeping an eye on it, so then what am I going to do about it? And one of my greatest problems is the lack of consensus about media reporting. And I mean lack of consensus from experts who I talk to. So I have some people telling me that we need to talk about it more, and we need to have people who have survived a suicide attempt to be talking about it more. And then I have an equally qualified person over here saying, no, we don't need to talk about it more, and if you talk about it more, the suicide rate will go up. And we don't need to hear from people who survived. We need to hear strategies that you can all use in your day-to-day life if you identify someone who might be depressed. So what am I going to say to that person? How am I going to identify them? Where am I going to get them help? So I have a very uneasy relationship with the media. In that sense, because I don't know what the right answer is. So I kind of leave it to other people and say, well, here's the data, and you're the expert, you go and talk about it, and I'll just keep on supplying you with the data. The Coroner's Act doesn't help really in that regard. It has quite restrictive provisions, and so some might say that's good, and some are going to say that's bad, and I'm just going to stay in the middle because I'm a judge, I don't have a view. But they have restrictive provisions about what you can report. And you cannot report that a death, you can't report the method of suicide in New Zealand. So you can report that the death is a suspected suicide, you can't use the word suicide without the word suspected in front of it unless a coroner has said it's a suicide, so that's 2 years down the track when the investigation's finished. And you can't give any details that might suggest the method. And then the Act helpfully goes on to say, but if you wanted to report the method or any details that might suggest the method, you can make a request to the Chief Coroner, and she can, without delay, I think all the words, something like that, will consider your application. So we haven't had that many applications, but it does raise issues, particularly in this fast-moving media world, of, say, and we had a case a few months ago of a person who was being pursued by the police, and that was being reported by the media as it happened, because it happened to be occurring in a big city and became known, and so it was kind of minute by minute reporting, and then the person suicided, and not suspected, I suppose, because I don't think the investigation has been completed. But the problem with that is, of course, the method of death was already live all over the news. So how does the Coroner's Act fit into that? And the media wanted to report it, so this was happening at midday, so it had already been on the midday news as it was happening, including the method. And then it suddenly became a suspected suicide, so the Coroner's Act comes in. So how do you unravel all that attention? And so I had some media very sensibly and responsibly making applications to me, saying, can we report what's already out there? And others just carried on and just said, oh, well, you know, that's life, or not. So there are some problems with media reporting, and we just must work our way through them. But it would be nice if there was some consensus amongst the experts about what the model should be. So the Act says that if I am going to allow somebody to report the method of death or any details that might suggest the method, then I must consider whether that would pose an undue risk of copycat behaviour and whether that would be outweighed by other public interest. So as I said, there haven't been that many applications, and I have declined all of them because no one has persuaded me yet that the public interest would require the details to be published. But I guess if there was some novel new way of suiciding that posed a risk to people, then you might want to publish that to say, well, would you want to publish it? I don't know. So just say no. Okay, fine. That's why the Act also sets up an expert panel that I can take advice from when I'm considering these applications. So, and I think they did that. Oh, no, anyway. So the Act requires us to send recommendations to organisations in draft before we publish them in our findings. So of course a lot of those recommendations go to hospitals, prisons, police, who have people in custody and who may be a suicide risk. So they're given a chance to respond to our recommendations, to tell us whether we've got it all wrong, or they've tried that particular recommendation and it didn't work, or whether that recommendation's just not workable. And those are all available online at NZLE, which is a website, legal website. So any coroner's investigation that has a recommendation made will have a summary of the case, the recommendation, and then any response that we receive will be online, so you can have a look at those. So I just wanted to go through now a few of the recommendations that keep on coming up that coroners have made over the years, over and over again. And when I asked the coroners what the themes were that they saw, these are some of the examples they gave. So this was a case of a 16-year-old male, and the coroner said that there needed to be a whole of sector response. So quite often we see in our cases that someone has become depressed, being referred by a GP, has perhaps seen adolescent mental health service, and then the care is transferred back. perhaps the school doesn't know anything about this. You often see this very segmented kind of, I'm taking care of that person now, or I don't need to take care of that person now because this person over here is doing it. So you get these holes in the care. And so the coroner in this particular case was saying you need to have a better process of handing care over and making sure that there are no gaps in the care. This one, so again, we see time and time again that a person makes a threat of suicide and almost immediately retracts it, or says, well, yes, I've been thinking about it, but I'm not going to do it. And so the family or the colleagues at work are lulled into a false sense of security and don't do anything about it. And it just occurs over and over again. So I guess my message would just be, if they're talking about it, then you need to get them some help, or they need to get themselves some help. Coroner Nanagara did the 4 deaths of females in a particular area, and again it was this theme of lots of agencies involved with both the families and the girls, but no particular joined up service. So there was no long-term plan. There were a lot of short-term plans and a lot of shifting around of care. And she recommended a mental health service high complex need user coordinator to coordinate all those responses, to say, well, this is the person, what are we all going to do? How are we going to make sure that they just don't walk out the door and be forgotten about? This one, a difficult one, but there was confusion around the risk of this patient, which I know must be fiendishly difficult to assess, but in fact this patient had threatened to walk out of the unit and to do a specific act, which is in fact exactly what she ended up doing. The problem was that it was early in the morning at handover time. The coming staff had not had an opportunity to go back through the notes, so they didn't know about the specific threat. And then when she left the unit, there was confusion about the legality of the actions that they could take to bring her back. So while they were looking at the notes to say, well, what's the risk in the computer, and then discussing whether they could actually physically restrain her or not because of her status under the Mental Health Act, she in fact left the unit and did exactly what she had told them some 24 hours beforehand that she was going to do. So the message there was obviously people need to know what to do and not be standing around saying, no, can we use force or not, or whatever. This one, I think, a lot of times people are presenting to the emergency department, which must be one of the worst places to be if you are feeling suicidal or mentally ill, because they're generally very noisy and you generally have to wait a very long time. And so this recommendation was saying that they have presented, you need to be taking care of them, not just saying stand over there or wait in that room, somebody will see you in 5 hours. There needs to be somewhere where they can be safe until you can get someone to have a look at them and assess their risk. And in this particular case, they suicided before they had been properly assessed. The family said that if they had known that the person was going to be left alone, they thought that the person was safe because they were at the hospital and that's the best place to be. So they left. They said if they'd known that the person was going to be left alone, they would never have left. They would have sat there all night if need be. So it was the communication with the family and to make sure that that person was taken care of. This one, the usual disclosure to the family, whether to make it or not. Again, the family were very aggrieved that they had not been told of the risk and that they didn't have an opportunity to care for their family member. Oh, I guess, yes, this one, they did not attend, has been mentioned quite a lot today. So again, somebody's discharged from the service and they're given an appointment in 7 days and then they don't come, and so DNA, and they might get a text message or something and they don't respond, so couldn't contact them, no longer part of the service, will close the file. So in this particular case, the coroner criticised that to say that they needed to have better discharge policies and to make sure that contact was made somehow, and that the person wasn't just left to their own devices. The factors are the kind of things we see all the time, and in this particular case they all came together. So I think it's well known that relationship breakups often occur just before a suicide. Recent engagement with the police or the mental health service seems to be a highlight, and unemployment, and this poor person had all of the risks but had denied that they were going to do anything and didn't get the help that they needed. And again, just a delay in service. So I guess if we're going to summarise what we've learned as coroners, is that communication between the agencies, taking threats seriously. I guess one of the things I haven't spoken is about the compulsory treatment. Some of the cases involved, there seemed to have been a reluctance on the part of the clinicians to invoke the compulsory procedures of the Mental Health Act, and so therefore when the person went to leave, confusion about whether they should be prevented or not, and then they've gone on to harm themselves. And providing information to family members. So, that's it.